Hello everyone, I'm Julian Bucknall, the CTO at DevExpress, and I'm taking over from Amanda just for today. Our Technical Evangelist Paul Usher will be showing you how you can easily incorporate UI testing in your web application development workflow. In this presentation, Paul will show you how Testcafe and Testcafe Studio can be leveraged to deliver high-quality web apps that always meet end-user expectations. You'll be seeing how to set up Testcafe and start testing in under 10 minutes, how to create customizable tests that can easily evolve as businesses' requirements change, the purpose of custom selectors and why they make web testing so much easier, the purpose of the page model approach we use and why it helps increase productivity, and you'll learn how to master the use of Smart Assertions. We will do a live Q&A at the end of the presentation. Just type your questions in your GoToWebinar control panel at any time throughout the broadcast. The Testcafe team are here. They're behind the scenes and they'll answer your questions, and we'll cover the more interesting questions later on. Of course, as with all our webinars, this presentation will be uploaded and made available on YouTube within a day. Now, thank you for joining us. I will now hand things over to Paul. Hello, Paul.
Hey, Julian, and thank you. Good morning to everyone across the globe. We've had an overwhelming response to this presentation, which just goes to show how many people believe in the importance of end-to-end UI testing. Let's start by talking about that importance. As developers, we often use unit tests or test-driven development to help ensure the quality of our code. But the reality is we need to test our web apps the way that a user will interact with them. And if we expect a tester to do this manually over and over, it can become frustrating. It can demoralize teams and it can cause to poor quality and lost deadlines. That's where automated UI tests can really simplify the workload. Now, traditionally, software-based products required special web drivers or browser plugins, which created additional problems, browser limitations, version and product compatibilities. So the team, when they started with Testcafe, wanted to create something that would transcend all of those issues. So what is Testcafe? Well, in short, it's a cross-browser platform to automate those end-to-end tests, be it a simple website or a complex web app or service. It allows you to create tests using modern JavaScript or TypeScript and then run those tests across all popular browsers, across multiple platforms, including mobile. Now, there are two main elements to Testcafe. There's Testcafe Engine, which is an open source framework. And then there's Testcafe Studio, which is our commercial offering, allowing you to easily record visual tests and also encompasses a powerful code editor. Today, I'm going to be mainly focused on the open source engine, and I will give you a bit of a look at Testcafe Studio later on. But here's what we're going to cover. We're going to talk about the importance of fixtures and how tests work within fixtures. We're going to look at how we can simplify some of those processes with hooks, attack the authentication model, and let's see how easy it is to add user roles into your tests. And then start looking at extending those tests out for long-term maintainability and readability using the page model. We're going to be covering selectors, assertions, and actions as we create these tests. We'll look at ways that you can use custom client functions to interact with the client side back to the server. We'll talk about continuous integration, the setup guides and recipes that the Testcafe website offers, and we're also going to take a quick look at Testcafe Studio. A note on today's presentation: I'm going to be using examples from a new book that's been written and published by a freelance developer and test guru, Dennis Martinez. It's going to show off a real-world application that he built and offer some great insights into test practices. I'm also going to include a link to the book and a special offer from Dennis at the end of the session. The first step, obviously, is to look at what's required to install Testcafe. The prerequisite is to have Node.js installed. Now, Node.js is a JavaScript runtime environment that allows you to run your JavaScript code outside of your web browser. Installing Node.js also includes the Node Package Manager, or NPM. And we recommend that you install the LTS or long-term support version, although Testcafe will run on either or. The thing to remember as well is that Testcafe will work on Windows, Linux, and Mac OS. Today I'm going to be running Mac OS. Once you've installed Node.js from nodejs.org, you can look at the different options for installation. Now, there's two ways to look at installing Testcafe. One is globally, to which you can just run the Node Package Manager command line, npm install -g Testcafe. Once that's completed, you can then start using Testcafe from a command line. That whole process takes less than a minute. If you're wanting to use Testcafe locally in a project, and particularly if you work with products such as continuous integration, you can use npx, you can use yarn run, or npm scripts and actually run Testcafe within your project directory. And as I mentioned, continuous integration methods, that's where you'd start from. One other note, if you're using Testcafe on Mac OS, Catalina, or newer, you're going to be prompted with the privacy sections now to allow screen recording. Today's presentation is actually going to be run using Mac OS Big Sur. So I'm running the beta and happy to announce that Testcafe works really quite nicely with that. For the majority of what we're doing, I'm going to be running inside VS Code. It gives us the ability of seeing the code cleanly and also looking at the terminal when I run the tests. Now, all the tests are organized into categories, which we call fixtures. When we create a JavaScript file, and from here on in, whenever I say the word JavaScript, it could be referring to JavaScript or TypeScript. But when I create that JavaScript file, I'm going to place a fixture inside there. And within a fixture, I can place one or many tests. Now, whilst it is possible that a single file can have more than one fixture, we feel it's the best practice to do one fixture per file. And let's take a look at our first example. We can see that as a JavaScript file, we're doing an import, the selector object from the Testcafe library, and then we're hitting the all-important fixture. Now, fixture is invoked with the actual name of the fixture. We're going to see where this gets used, and then a pointer to the page where we're going to be running the test. I'm just going to manually launch this first test page so we can see. It's a page that the team put together, and it's going to be great just to make sure that your instance, your implementation of Testcafe is working the way that you want. Considering that most websites are going to have things like text boxes, buttons, checkboxes, disabled features, enabled based on checkboxes, radio buttons, combos, and even text areas. So as a quick example page, it ticks all of those boxes. Before I step through what's actually happening in the test code, I want to make sure that Testcafe is installed and operating correctly. And to actually run my first test, all I need to do is type Testcafe, but then I need to pass in the name of a browser. Well, since I'm running this for the first time, I'm not sure what browsers are available to Testcafe. It's got the intelligence to actually tell me which ones it's detected, and I can just type in Testcafe -- list of browsers. And we're going to see some names pop up, and these are the names that I can interact with Testcafe. I've got Firefox available, Safari, and Chrome. So for today, I'm going to be focusing on Chrome, and we'll see that when I want to run a test, it's going to be Testcafe, browser name, so Chrome, and then the name of my test. Again, before we step through what's happening, let's see Testcafe in action. At this point, Testcafe is starting to run. It's going to open an instance of the browser and then consume the page within that instance. If I'd passed in an invalid JavaScript file, it would tell me at this point. But here we can see the page flicked up, did a few things, and we've got this information sitting in the terminal. And if we look through what information it's showing, it ran the test in Chrome version 84, Mac OS 10.16. We have the name of the fixture, Testcafe Example, and we also have the fact that the test that ran has a tick, and it was called Fill Out and Submit Form, It passed and took just 4 seconds. Let's then break down and take a look at the anatomy of that particular test. Once we've got inside the fixture, we mentioned that we're opening this page. We've got the test, which takes the name of the test. It then has this test context object or a test controller, and that's passed into this promise. Once I'm inside promise, you're going to see the word await used all the way through all of our tests. And this is one of the mechanisms Testcafe employs to mean that we don't actually have to write manual code to have elements or wait for elements to appear on the page or in the DOM. The test is comprised of 3 key aspects. We've got actions, which we can see here. We've got selectors. In this case, we're looking at an element ID, and we've got assertions. So I'll be going into each of these in more detail as we step through, but effectively we can see that after submitting the button, we've got an expectation, so an assertion, to say something's passed or not passed. This example, we can see that we've got chaining occurring under our click event. So when we've got a particular action, we can chain events that will be run as required. I did mention before that we're going to use a real-world application today. So let me introduce you to Team Yap. As it says on the box, it's the companion web application for the book that Dennis actually wrote. As with most modern applications, it deals with authentication, it deals with roles, data handling, and all the samples that we fire are going to be pushed against this test. And the first one we're going to look at is authentication. Probably one of the most common scenarios when you're working with an application. Now, before the security conscious of you start firing in the question box, yes, I'm using a plain text password here. And there's a couple of things to consider. One is the fact that I'm in a test environment, and so my data shouldn't be working in a production environment. 2, we're doing this simply so that we can explain the processes that Testcafe use. You can utilize environment variables, you could utilize a third-party library, you could bring it in from a vault, keep it as a secret key. We're going to see some of the ways that I'm abstracting that out as we go along as well. But for now, we're just going to see that data sitting there. Again, we've got the test controller coming in. We're seeing the action on the selector, so email, passing an email address, and a submit login. And we've then got our assertion, which is expecting that the inner text contains my login details. Firing that test off, make sure that everything's working with our Team Yap app. Again, we're going to see that engine fire up, and we're hoping to see the login take place. Great start for my test. What I'm planning on doing is taking you through that progressive build stages of me working with a new application and all the things that I might do to add in. And then as we move on and look at some of the more intricate features of Testcafe, we're going to see I'm going to do some refactoring and move pieces around to simplify and make the code maintainable long term. So having logged into my application, the next thing I might want to do is actually look at creating a new feed. Again, we're within a single test, and all that's going to happen is it's going to post. I'm not going to dwell too much on some of these examples. I'm just going to fire them up so that you can see they are real world and they're working in the back end with Team Yap as an application. The next progressive step that I would get to once this test completes would be to then say, well, we know we can post an element, but what about actually replying to that and commenting to that? So we're going to move on to feed test number 2, just to get you familiar with the way that these tests are coming through. Here we've actually got a couple of tests. So before we had the one, we can now see I've got 2. One is doing the login user to create the feed, and the other is that a login user can comment on it. And what you'll notice straight away is that we're starting to get repetitious code. I'll run the test up so we can see it happening. And it's going to be a segue into how to deal with that repetition. wait for the engine to spool up, and we're going to see things like the logon process for the first test kick in. It's then going to switch the page, log in again for the second test. Of course, if I was running Testcafe with headless mode, so I'm in continuous integration, you're not going to have these visual elements pop up. Testcafe is going to be doing all the work behind the scene and reporting back to you. Here we can see that again, I ran my team yap feed fixture, and I've now got 2 tests that passed, and my execution time, we've got green lights across the board. It's a good time then to start thinking about how we can deal with some of those repetitive behaviors. And that introduces to our next topic, which is hooks. There's going to be a lot of times when we're running code that needs to be run before a test, and it could be before every test, such as initializers, logins, cleanups, database setup. And Testcafe introduces 2 types of hooks. We've got test hooks and fixture hooks. Now, a test hook is something that you define to function that will be run before test execution. We can see that that can be done in 2 ways. If we want something to run before absolutely every test, we can introduce the before each function. So the code inside that block is going to run before every test in the fixture. Now, there is the exception where overridden. Equally, the after each would run after every test unless that exception occurs. So what is the exception? If we move into the test block, we can see that we can actually implement a before function inside the test itself. So this would actually execute in place of the code in the before each. So that becomes the exception. And exactly the same process for the after function. If we were to look at what that would do with these tests, the before and after belong to this test, so it would only execute that code as defined in its before and after, whereas subsequent tests, because they don't have their own methods, would actually execute the code in the before each and after each function of the test. So straight away, that starts to become a little more powerful. There's actually a test context available inside the before each and after each elements, and that can be actually consumed within the test itself. So here we can see that we've got the context on the test object. We're setting a property called login name. That login name can be consumed within each of the tests that it applies to. If we take a look at the before element here, remember that the before function is firing only inside the test it belongs to. We're setting the login name property on the context inside the test. This test will pass. I'm going to pick it up from the fact that fixtures have a before function and an after function. And this code is executed only once when a test is run, and the after is executed only once. Now, this is useful for creating databases, for cleaning up things such as test data that's been put in. Now, unlike the function of the before each or the after each, this doesn't have access to the test context. It doesn't allow it to interact with a page. You can, however, still pass information from a before method into a test using the fixture context rather than just the context. So what does all that mean when we put it together and start looking at a refactored example? Well, before we wanted to actually log in and authenticate for each of the tests that we ran. Here what we can do is put that authentication code inside the before each function, and therefore stripping it away from these tests. Obvious benefits, cleaner code, and there's only one place to maintain. Before we jump up and down again, yes, I know there's cleaner ways to do that. We're going to step into it. But as an example of using that before each, let's run the example of 09. We're going to see the engine spin up. And what we're looking here is that the actual authentication process is going to happen twice. It's going to happen inside that loop, which is all we're really wanting to confirm We know that that is therefore being executed each and every time we want it to. Test passed, and we're happy. So hooks themselves become really powerful, and there's so many different ways, obviously, that we can then utilize that methodology. We can implement an override for an individual test. We can use the before method on the fixture itself, or the before each to run before and each test without that exception. So we've previously looked at using hooks to manage authentication. However, there's a much nicer way, and one that allows multiple role scenarios. And you certainly don't want to be including login details in every test file. You also don't want to be logging in the user in and out when you're wanting to look at different roles, because that wastes precious time and time that's important when it comes to our integrated tests. Now, in most modern apps, there's a concept of roles. There's a concept of an admin and a regular user. And if your application looks at role-specific UI functionality, you want to be able to test that as well. Testcafe offers that ability. It allows me to log in once, stay on with that user role throughout my entire test. And it stores information into the browser's cookies and storage areas to remember the state and allow me to switch back to where it was. What's really nice there is that's going to save time. It also allows me to create this clean and simple way to handle multiple accounts. So we'll start out by creating this helper class. And the helper class is importing the role object. Using the export keyword, we can make this particular object available in our other tests. And we're saying that admin user is creating a new instance of a role, taking in the URL, doing exactly the same action that we've done elsewhere. And we can also see that I've created a regular user using Julian's account. It's probably one of the only times I get to have higher access to anything than him. And now we can look at consuming that throughout our refactoring. If we go back to the test that we just ran, instead of having that code sitting in our hook, our before each hook, we can see that I'm now implementing. I've imported the file up here from my helper class. I'm only using admin user for this particular test, but I can now use the use role function and tell it to set my admin user. Straight away, we can see that should those credentials change, I only need to update my helper class. And if I'm just writing tests, I don't even need to care necessarily what those credentials are anymore. So we've got that extra level of abstraction. As we're setting the precedence, we'll just quickly run the test and make sure that that new method is working. Spin up the engine. All we're looking for to start with is the fact that it's going to log me in, and that's going to prove the fact that the role is now working. Happy days. You would have noticed at that point, we've got two tests, and we know that the login process is happening before each and every test. But what you would have seen, although it was very, very quick when it did the screen switch, is it didn't actually have to apply the credentials the second time that it brought up the web page. And that's the beauty when using the role models inside Testcafe. It's going to remember, hey, I've already done that once. This is where that was at, and implement that. So what does that look like when we want to talk about multiple roles? We've got a test here that's going to make sure that the admin can see the admin features of the sidebar. And to do that, it's going to use the admin user role. It's going to check the assertion using the selector to access the sidebar, grab the inner text, and make sure that it matches the organization setting. Then we want to test and make sure that a standard user can't see the admin section. It's going to do the same thing, only use the not contains assertion instead. And then finally, we're going to use the admin user again, switch back, and make sure that it's still okay. I'm going to come back to this anonymous role in just a second. I've purposely written the test so that when I run this, it's going to do admin, switch to regular, then switch back to admin, so that you get that feel for exactly what's going on with the roles model. Testcafe launches the page. admin user logs in, processes some data, regular user logs in, processes some data, switches back to the admin user, and again we're seeing that we didn't actually pass in any credentials for the second. So very, very powerful way to jump between those different roles. Now, if we wanted to then run some roles based on somebody not logged in at all, we don't have to write any additional code to write code and say log out. I mean, you might have a test to make sure that your logout process is correct, but in this instance, if I wanted to go off and do something, I can actually use this anonymous function on the role object. So here we'd say we're using admin, do some functions, come back and switch the anonymous role. What this is going to do is actually remove all of those authenticated user settings that it's stored in the browser and then perform actions as if that user is logged out. The other thing I just want to call your attention to at this point is the fact that in my output, I've got my fixture details, I've got 3 tests that all passed, and then I've got this test in blue that's got a dash. And in my summary, it says that 1 was skipped. And it's a good time to call out the skip feature. If you're working through Testcafe and you want to bypass some tests for whatever reason, simply add the skip function in front and the test will be ignored. It will still report and tell you that it's actually been run. So far, we've used different selectors to tell Testcafe what we wanted to interact with. And we've done this with either class name or ID. We've also seen things like the nth method used. At the end of the day, it works, but it doesn't necessarily make your tests easily readable to everyone. And as with roles, there's a natural, easier way to encapsulate this into more descriptive methods. And that's done using the page object model or the page model. Let me explain this in a little more detail. At its essence, it's a design pattern that allows you to separate the logic related from the UI from your test code, making your test easy to read and manage. What we're going to do is take, again, that previous test, refactor, and use this approach. So to start with, I've got this login page model. We can see that I'm importing the selector from the Testcafe library. I'm creating this class called login page model, which has then been exported to be used wherever else I need. And in the constructor, I'm setting up these fields or properties that are taking the data from the selector. So from that perspective, it's working the same as we've seen elsewhere, but it's been encapsulated into this page model. Using that very first test that we did, we can see how that would work. We've got this action, but instead of actually trying to do the selector at this level, I can now interact with the page model, which means that this is more readable. It also makes it more maintainable because the class name or the ID may change. And again, it means that I only have to worry about changing it in one place. So we can see how each of these layers is building on the last one to provide that nice functionality. Spinning up that test just to prove that the page model method is operating. And then what we're going to do is move forward and do the same thing with the feed model. There we are, we're logged in and the test passed. Done exactly the same thing, created a new file for my feed page. We can see that as I create each of these properties, we're going to start seeing benefits straight away. We can see that within the constructor itself, I can start using previous selectors or previous fields, properties that I've created. When we introduce that into our test and we refactor our test, it really starts to stand out that the test becomes easier to read. Somebody writing the test can be actually testing the code, and as a developer, I've created these models and made them available. The tester can just consume that without having to worry too much about what the class names or the IDs actually were. This test has been extended slightly. We're still using the hook for our authentication. We've now utilized the after each function to start to clean up the data. So after each time I run the test, I'm using one of the features in TeamYap to then remove all those feeds that I've been adding, which is just a nice thing to do, cleaning up as you go with tests. You're not left with copious amounts of bad data. Everything else is the same, apart from we're using the models to actually drive everything. Spinning up test 16. And we'll just make sure that that runs as it should. One of the other things you can do is you can expand the model pattern to perform certain actions. So you could build in functionality to be clicking and have your own methods inside that model. We can see the new screen popping up there to delete the data. We're still logged in as admin, so we didn't have to re-authenticate, and the test pass using that page model approach. Then all the tests we've carried out so far, we've been using all the key elements of Testcafe. What we want to do is just step through some of those in a little more detail. We'll start out by looking at selectors. And in short, selectors are chainable functions allowing you to traverse the DOM in a jQuery style. Now, depending on what element you target will depend on what kind of action or what kind of assertion that you can or will perform. The thing to remember here is that Testcafe will automatically wait for that targeted element to become visible and will fail if the timeout expires. Some examples of selectors on screen. Passing back to our feed post using the class name of selector. We can use the same thing, passing the class name, but actually overriding the default, so accessing the visibility check. And this last example, we can actually have a selector returned from a JavaScript method. Here we're seeing an example of actually fetching the element ID from the browser's local storage. So it's a simple example, and we're going to look at client functions, which extends this theory even more as we get through the presentation. Some more examples of selectors. We've got some HTML fragments up here, and we can see the nth function that we utilized in one of those tests earlier. Now, interestingly, when we get down to this particular one, because our feed only has 3 entries, 0, 1, and 2, our test is actually going to fail because trying to access the 3rd, or technically the 4th element, but index position 3 on the array is going to fail. We've got things such as being able to call with text. With text is a partial match, and it is case sensitive. If we're using regular expressions with text, we can also call it with the flag to say, hey, I want to use a case insensitive regex. We've got things such as with exact text. So this time it's looking for specifics. And in fact, what I'm going to do is show you some of the filter methods that we can look at with there. On top of filter methods, we've also got search methods. And with that, we can use find parent. We can access child siblings and traverse the sibling hierarchy, next and previous. And then there's some other properties available, such as exists and count. One of the other things with selectors is you can access other properties that would be available on elements in the DOM. We've seen examples of inner text, text content, visible values checked. The documentation goes into so much depth as to the power that you can achieve with the selectors. Let's think about actions for a second. Actions are the fundamental piece that's going to allow us to step through the application applying the human element. Now, the actions exist on the test controller object, and they offer functionality for clicking, typing text, as we've seen. But you can also use it to navigate through the app. You can have it for triggering key presses, for selecting text, partial text, from either text objects or text areas. Websites that implement hover functionality, you can actually use a hover action. You can pause your test manually if you want to. Now, remembering that Testcafe doesn't require you to do that for every element. It's using that await and callback process, but you can manually pause your test if you want. You can take screenshots at any point during your test. You can also take video and have those stored within your test results. You can perform complex drag and drop functionality. You can even have Testcafe perform uploading of files and the resizing of your browser windows. And what I've done for the last couple of tests is set up another few page models. The first one being a settings page model, where we're looking for the profile picture and a clear button, and then the application page model, allowing me to make sure that I've got access to things such as, in this case, a toast notification. And imagine we want to test and make sure that something's happened. A toast element is only going to be there. It's only going to be visible for a small amount of time. Just going to jump over to our Team Yap application and show you this manually before we run the test. We're going to come down to settings, and we're talking about this profile picture here. Effectively, what I want to write the test to do is to invoke the change. Here we've got a window that's waiting for a pop-up element. We want to select an image. We want to upload that image, which is happening now in the background. We're going to see a toast notification appear to say that it was updated, and the clear button is now available. Then what I want to do is write the test that will clear, confirm that the picture has been removed, and also confirm that the functionality of the clear button has disappeared. And we can do that in quite a simple way. Here's our test. We're using our hook to do our admin functionality. We're then navigating, so we've changed the navigate method straight to the settings page. The test is that the user can update and delete the profile picture. We're calling this set files to upload, which is then using the page model to access the profile picture input element. And inside my folder, I've got this file uploads folder with a profile picture, and that's what's being referenced as the second parameter for the files to upload. We're then looking at the assertion to make sure that the toast notification said my picture was updated. We're then making sure that the clear button exists. We're clicking the clear button, making sure that the toast notification said my picture was removed, and then making sure that the clear button no longer exists. So a nice, straightforward, yet slightly comprehensive test. Let's see what happens when we run that and how Testcafe can process. We're going to see an error now, which is great. This is what happens when your test file doesn't exist. We can see, I'll just bring the terminal up, that in actual fact, I invoked Testcafe to run file 26. File 26 did not match any of the patterns, therefore we got an error. This time I'll do it properly and invoke the whole of the file name. Engine's going to start. It's going to spool up the page. Now remembering that we're using here the action of file upload, and all this is happening into the browser, no interaction from me. We can see waiting for element to appear, toast notification, buttons checked, everybody's happy, 13 seconds, and I can run that test as often as I want to make sure that functionality is working. The final thing to then look at before we jump to the web browser and look at client functions is going to be assertions. And we've talked about them, we've looked at different options with them. And effectively for every assertion, you're going to have the opposite assertion. So equals, not equals, okay, not okay. We saw that with the button just before, contains, not contains. We can also do things like make sure that the type of an object is what we want or not what we want. Particularly useful for looking at things such as undefined. We've got greater than equals, less than equals, and widths and matches. So assertions become, again, part of that great arsenal. I'm going to switch over to the Testcafe website now and talk to you about client side or client functions. And then we're going to look at some of the other things that's available on this very rich knowledge base. We looked at the fact that a selector would let you return some data from client side, but there's lots of other reasons that you might want to do that. For example, you can return any serializable value, such as the current URL or complex DOM data. I'm going to jump down to the examples and look at two such ones. The first one is a simple test to actually check a page URL. We can see that we're importing the client function, and that is simply returning window location href. So it could be as simple as an inline lambda, where we're then saying our assertion, call the get page URL, which is this client function, and make sure it contains a thank you so that the redirect has happened. Powerful, yet simple. If we move down to a more complex example, here we've got a test page that was set up that has data set up in a grid. And the test that we want is to make sure that the data is in the right place and that the right values are being represented. So what we end up doing is creating a client function that grabs the information from that grid, and we can see as it's navigating through that we're then selecting all elements into these objects from that grid. We then run through and create an array based on each of those elements. So we're effectively saying the sales object for every entry is this, the customer for every entry is that, and it returns that array. When we look at the test, we're saying, okay, our assertion is expecting that the amounts returned from that client function match these entries. So you can do some amazing things with client libraries. While I'm on this particular site, I want to call out the fact that there's the whole getting started for Testcafe engine. We've been through the installation. There's the guides. We talked about being able to integrate with things like reporting engines. So we go to continuous integration. If I want to know how to integrate with Azure DevOps, so if I want to know how I can integrate with Jenkins, there's the injecting different client scripts, there's screenshots. You can see there's lots of examples. If we jump to recipes, it provides so many different examples on exactly how to integrate with Gulp, with Grunt, some of the best practices around creating helpers, data-driven tests, all the way through to full examples on every aspect of Testcafe. I did promise at the beginning that I would also give you a quick look at Testcafe Studio. And to do that, I'm going to be jumping in and out of a couple of screens, and that's because of the resolution that I'm currently running in. So let me switch over to Testcafe Studio. Testcafe Studio allows you to easily create visual tests. The idea is you put your URL here, and you can literally just start recording the elements on your web page, and it's going to pick it up in the background. If I show you just what that would look like, you imagine I've clicked on each of these elements on a website. Testcafe Studio's recorder is going to come through and build each of these actions as it happens. We can see that I can manually bring in on-page actions. So I can bring in a click, a right click. I can work through all of the things, but in a visual aspect. It's designed with a non-developer in mind. And it takes that powerful engine that we've spent the last 50 minutes looking at and puts it on steroids to allow this visual interaction. When you're recording it, you can drill in and pick specific CSS elements. You don't have to just take the first one that's selected by the cursor. You've got the ability to drag or add the assertions. You can then work with the assertions, bring in methods. Again, you're seeing things like the end. You're seeing all the things we talked about. I want with text as a regular expression. All the things that we've looked at in our JavaScript code is available in a UI version. Now, having said that, I'll switch back to that directory in a second. I'm going to now call up the examples that I've been working on this morning, and we'll just look at the first one we started with. This is the JavaScript of my test. It's sitting inside beautiful IDE. It's got code collapse. It's got syntax highlighting. I can run the test exactly the same as I did with my command line, and I can do that all within the visual environment. I've got access to setting up my configurations. I can run multiple simultaneous browsers at a time. I can specify that I can have screenshots taken automatically if something happens within my test. So there's a lot of easy to access data and information at this point. I can change which browser I want my recording to be at. I can set my assertion default times or my selector default times. Everything's there as a WYSIWYG or a GUI version of what we've looked at. When I've run a test, I can drill down and see my test results in full detail, then I can drill into that actual test. One of the things that you can do, and again, I'll switch back to the examples that ship with Test Studio. I can take any one of these tests that is sitting in a visual aspect, and I can convert that back to a JavaScript test. So you can have people with less developer experience come in and create some initial tests and then convert them into their JavaScript code equivalents. Before anybody jumps in and asks a question, no, it doesn't go the other way. There's too much complexity of trying to convert JavaScript into the beauty that is a visual test, but it certainly works backwards the other way. And you can still implement things like custom scripts. You've got the ability to switch between your frames. You can handle things like the native browser dialogues. All those things that we've talked about so far can be done in a visual aspect. Now, I'm going to be brave and try and switch back to my main screen. In the meantime, I'm going to bring up some links that I want to share. If you want to get in touch with the team, they're available on Twitter at DXTestcafe. You can access Testcafe Engine, so the open source that we've been looking at all morning, at our GitHub page, devexpress.github.io/Testcafe. If you want to experiment and play with Testcafe Studio, you can download a free trial at devexpress.com/Testcafe Studio. And the book that Dennis released, you can find out more information at testingwithtestcafe.com. Hit it with /webinar, and there is a discount available for anybody that's interested in the book. And again, a big shout out for the work that Dennis has done on that. Julian, questions?
It was kind of interesting over on the Q&A or the questions area of the webinar. So let me review a couple. I'll try not to repeat myself. First of all, to be sure, if you go to devexpress.com/Testcafe Studio, there'll be a link there that goes to the documentation about Testcafe Studio and how to use it, and how to create tests, how to run them, verify that they're passing, and all that kind of good stuff. So for Testcafe Studio, and as Paul mentioned, the Testcafe itself, the engine, if you like, which requires you to write lots and lovely JavaScript, is open source and is available on GitHub. So let me, we've had a great deal of questions, so let me see if I can't find the more interesting ones.
As you do that, I'll just point out that when I talk to the team, what we're going to do, because we figured there was going to be a high volume of questions come through, we're going to generate a blog post this event that will address the questions and also provide the answers. So there'll be a point of reference that you can come back, look at what other people asked. And on the website that we looked at just before, there is already a frequently asked questions group, which covers a lot of information. But Julian, throw a couple that come in and share the answers.
Okay. Does this integrate with Azure DevOps? Go for it, Paul.
Yes.
Brilliant.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. You'll find information for that at GitHub in our Testcafe documentation section on GitHub. Let me page back a little bit. Just to warn you, Testcafe Studio is a tool that you have to install. The open source Testcafe engine is Just download it, use it, basically. Dum-de-dum-de-dum. Let me see.
There was a question that I spotted regarding browsers, and Testcafe supports all modern browsers.
We had a couple of questions with regard to saying, why is this different from Selenium, or why is this different from Cypress? The biggest answer that I've come across is plugins. Paul was just using a bog standard browser. He had no plugins. Testcafe was able to launch the browser and use it as is. So you don't have to have your special testing browser with a plugin for Selenium or Cypress or anything like that. Another one that came up was, let me see if I can find it. Actually, I'll come across it, I'm sure, because I answered. Can you locate elements with XPath, or is it just CSS? The answer is you can still use XPath. You don't have to just have elements with CSS. Yes, we support Jenkins. We, going back to the actual web application itself, we'll support Angular, we support React, we support Knockout, we support jQuery. There's no problem with those kinds of frameworks.
The question regarding browser support, we support the Chrome, Stable Beta Dev, Canary, IE 11+, Microsoft Edge, both legacy and Chromium based, Firefox, Safari, Chrome Mobile, and Safari Mobile.
And my clock is chiming in the background. Let me see. Can the test be run in parallel? The answer is yes. I've just lost my place on the questions list here. You can start up to 100 parallel tests if your computer has sufficient resources to run such a number of browsers. Exactly. Every test you run basically loads up a browser. So yeah, you can run parallel tests, but you're going to be loading a browser into each. I do remember doing a demo at one point, maybe it was at a conference or something like that, where we basically ran the same test through many different browsers we could find, including one on my Kindle.
You have a Kindle?
I have a Kindle, yes.
One thing I want to call out is that you can actually use Testcafe Docker image as well. You can do a pull, and it comes complete with Chromium and Firefox installed.
Another advantage of using Testcafe over Selenium is there are no waits. You may have noticed Paul discussing async functions, and that's a built-in automatic waiting mechanism that we use in Testcafe, so you don't have to worry about waits and timing out and all that kind of good stuff, or bad stuff. Azure DevOps, we've talked about that. I think that's about it for now. As Paul said, we will edit the Q&A list here. There is an awful lot. We'll edit the Q&A list and produce a blog post to go along with the webinar when we upload it to YouTube. Thanks to Paul. Thank you for joining us. And of course, thank you for choosing DevExpress. Bye-bye.